Everyone, welcome. We're really excited to have you here today for our first Pact community event. I think I speak for all the maintainers that started as a Slack thread somewhere a few months ago to actually be doing this, and we've got nearly 300 people registered. It's pretty exciting. So I'm your MC today. My name is Elliot Murray, and for the Pythonistas, I am the Pact Python maintainer, and I'm going to be just running you through today. So the goals, when we originally started, this thread a few months ago, what we really wanted to do is firstly get in touch with the community and share, how we see Pact and how we use it and some of the problems that we see. So that could be a great knowledge sharing from us. But also, we thought it was a really great opportunity for you to get in touch with us. So we really want that two-way communication. So the second half of this is really dedicated to ways you can either directly talk to us today for the Q&A we're going to have, and or how you can contribute and stuff like that. So we really want to sort of widen the tent a little bit and get more of you involved. And then also, this was a little bit of an experiment. We weren't sure what the level of interest was, and we've been really pumped about how many people have kind of signed up and expressed their interest. So we do, once this crazy year, the COVID is over, the 2020 is done, we are actually wanting to see what the level of interest is around, is there an opportunity to do an in-person thing? So getting your feedback in this, we're going to have some feedback forms afterwards. So please, the more info we get, the better, really. So just onto some housekeeping. Get that. So hopefully you'll have this link, the Slido link. We're going to be curating all the questions today, and at the end, we'll try and get through as many as we can. The core maintainers will be feeding these questions and answering back. So this is a really great opportunity to get in touch with them. Obviously, you're all watching on YouTube. We're streaming. Hopefully that broadcast is working really well. And so that's going to be up there. You can obviously watch it any time. And obviously, hello to those who are watching post the event. Obviously, don't use that Slido link because we won't be answering straight away. But we'll have some other ways at the end to get in touch. We do have a code of conduct. So if you go to docs.pact.io, you can see that. It's mainly just about creating a safe space and a welcoming environment for everyone. So I don't think there's anything called rocket science in there, but please do read, whether just for today or sort of more generally if you want to contribute and be part of this community. So hopefully everyone's got that on their phone. And this is the plan for today. So you've got 5 minutes of me kind of whispering along, and then we're going to get to the really interesting stuff. We're going to start with Ron, Beth, and Matt doing the keynote, and then we're going to have a hands-on demo by Tim, and then a case study from Anto. And we thought having a hands-on plus also a bit more of a cultural, how to actually get it into an organization was a really good way of sharing what our experiences are with Pact. And then I'm going to do a bit of a roll call to try and get some of you more engaged in contributing, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that, and I'm going to walk you through some of the mechanisms of doing that. And then we're going to finish the last 35 minutes or so, depending on time, fill in your questions from Slido and have a panel discussion. So before we get started, I wanted to just make some call outs. I'll jump to the next slide, but firstly, I want to thank Trickwell for supporting this today. So that's Anto's company, and all the tooling that we're using to do today is from them. So really appreciate that. PactFlow, obviously, from Beth, Ron, and Matt. They obviously helping make this happen. And I've just started a new job personally at Infinity Works, and I'm only 2 weeks in, and they've already given me half a day off. So I really appreciate that they've been really welcome to me. So let's get on to the keynote. So I remember 7 years ago, Ron put this post up, and I remember reading it, and I'm not going to say I fully understood it. You know how dated it is, I was going to say, because of the spelling of microservice. It's got a hyphen in it. That's a pretty good dating mechanism. And it was, I guess, a bit of a seminal kind of post around contract-based testing. So he is going to really start us off, and I want us to get into a kind of Christmas theme of Pact past, Pact present, and Pact yet to come. And I'm not saying that Ron is Pact past by any kind of measure, but he's going to, what we thought would be really good is to explain how it started, how we got to where we are today, and also to talk about where we're going in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ron.
Cool. Thanks, Elliot. So I'm going to be talking about sort of the journey that Pact has taken over the last few years. And I guess with any journey, we've got to start somewhere way back in time, in the midst of time, a long time ago. For us, with Pact, a long time ago was 2013. Now, the whole Pact journey, there's kind of this overarching, you could say, like a theme, and the theme is basically to test smart and not hard, and so this is kind of the thing that we've had going, is the idea is to like question what you're doing, just don't accept the status quo, just think about what are we testing, what are we trying to guard against, and this is kind of where Pact came from. So way back we were 2013. We were basically heading out on the microservice journeys. Now, the microservices were pretty new then. It wasn't a major thing then. And we were kind of experimenting and working out a lot of the stuff as we went. So one of the things that we liked about microservices was this idea, it's like divide and conquer. You can basically divide up your domain into small little bits and try to build these little bits in isolation. And this is all great until you get to the point when you want to say, okay, now we want to deploy these. Is it safe to deploy? And the problem is when you're doing microservices and you've used divide and conquer, you can't answer that question without taking the complete system into account. So what you actually have to do is now reassemble your whole running system at a certain point. And we did this by having these end-to-end test environments. So you would deploy everything in there, and then you would test your new microservice out there or the next version of it, and everything's good. You then know, okay, it's now safe to deploy. Unfortunately, these environments were very difficult to maintain. 90% of the time, all the failures were actually related to the environment, not so much the application, and cost a lot of effort. One of the teams, what they did there is they were building a web app, and they kind of did as prototyping. They wanted to just have this little mock server because they couldn't wait on the other teams to build out all the services they needed. So they set it up a mock server to basically drive their user interface. But there was concern that the mock server would drift after the real applications get built. There'll be differences, and you wouldn't be able to just deploy things until you've tested them out. So they came up with this ingenious solution to create this idea of a pact. So the mock server will run the app, and then it will create a pact based on whatever interactions happened with it, and then you can now verify those interactions later. This seemed to be a really good solution to solve this problem where you had to build these big end-to-end environments to say, is this thing safe to deploy? What we could do now is we can just use these packs. And I found this was a really good strategy to help with that, answering that question. Is this component safe to deploy?
Hi, my name is Beth, and I'm one of the Pact core maintainers. I joined the client that Ron was working on a few months after Pact was first written. And when I started, Pact was being used just within a small group of teams that were all using Ruby. And the pacts were being exchanged using build artifacts, and the pacts were written in a format that was using Ruby-specific serialization for some of the matches. Now, this was working fine until Pact became popular enough within the company that a team writing a JVM microservice wanted to use it. Now, there were a few issues with this. Firstly, the JVM implementation had to actually be written, and it needed to be written in such a way that it would interoperate exactly with the Pact Ruby implementation. And this also brought up the issue of those Ruby-specific things that were in the Pact file that the JVM wouldn't be able to understand. Now, also, because of the way the AWS accounts were set up within this client, they didn't have access to our CI system. They were in a different business unit. So we needed another way to exchange these pacts. Now, the expansion of interest in Pact led to a couple of new significant developments for Pact. Firstly, the creation of the Pact broker. Now, the Pact broker is a service that was initially designed just to exchange the contracts, the pacts, but later on would support publishing the verification results and support the Can I Deploy feature. Now, the creation of the Pact broker was what allowed Pact to be wired into an application's release pipeline and to use contract testing to not only drive the API design, but also to be able to perform independent releases for each service and avoid having to deploy batches of applications together. The other key development that came out of Pact's expansion into the JVM world was the creation of the Pact specification and the idea of versioning that specification. The value of Pact lies in the fact that each implementation performs the verification and the matching in exactly the same way. The Pact spec allowed us to ensure that the matching would be done consistently by providing a comprehensive suite of test cases. And it also allowed us to define a new version of the Pact format to allow us to get rid of those Rubyisms and create a language-independent way of describing the interactions. Now, there's a rule of thumb about code reuse that says by the time you need to repeat a piece of code a third time, it's time to dry that up into a reusable component. So we had a Ruby implementation and a JVM implementation. But around 2015, there was growing interest for a JavaScript and a .NET implementation. And we didn't want to be in the situation we were trying to keep up with this growing number of Pact implementations in different languages and keep them all in sync with each other. So we made the decision to package up the existing Ruby implementation as a standalone executable using a tool called Traveling Ruby. And over the years, this was used to support Pact implementations in 6 other languages. So the Pact Ruby standalone has its pros and its cons. It was great to be able to get so many languages up and running with Pact so quickly and to have them all behaving exactly the same way. But because the tool was only available as a command line interface, it meant that it was harder to create an elegant native interface that would allow you to do the same kind of stubbing and mocking as you could with a native testing tool. And it was also a large and a slow dependency. Now, I mentioned that the Pact Ruby standalone was used to implement Pact in 6 languages. Now, there's actually support for Pact in more than 10 languages now. And this cross-language support is what makes Pact unique in the contract testing space, and it's one of its greatest strengths. It's also, as a maintainer, one of the greatest challenges. Trying to keep features and docs and support consistent across 10 languages is a massive challenge, and it's not something I've ever heard of any other tool attempting.
Cool. Okay, so that was awesome. 2013 to 2015, we really got Pact up off the ground. We got the Pact broker, which really helps the use case and helps you to get that value out of doing the whole thing. But then around 2015, we also another thing happened. So I was at another client now. And we were trying to roll out microservices there, and I was trying to influence people there to use Pact to do a lot of their can things communicate with each other type of tests instead of integration tests. And it was okay. There were challenges, as everyone finds, trying to convince people on doing something a little bit different. But then one of our services we had to integrate with a Kafka message queue. Now, so for the HTTP interactions, we had Pact, verifying things, but there was nothing obviously for message queues. Now, the prevailing attitude there was kind of like, well, if you have a service that needs to write to a queue, you just build a service and you put your message in your queue. And then your job is done. It's kind of like a lob it over the fence type mentality. It's now somebody else's problem. If they want to consume this message, they will need to be able to consume it properly, and that's not our concern. And this was kind of worrying to me, that we're creating something and putting on a queue that we don't even know who's going to be reading. The other thing is, like queues like Kafka, they're actually persistent queues. So you could, much later, months later, somebody could create a totally new service that's going to read off this queue, and it can process from the beginning. what will happen is if we now want to change this message, we have no idea who's going to be reading it. And in fact, we don't even know if someone in the future is going to be reading it, and they could be processing the message and get halfway through and suddenly the message format changes. So I was talking to the solution architect at the time and saying, well, look, I think this is a really big problem. It's actually an even bigger problem than with HTTP because there's no direct communication. We have no idea who's going to be reading these messages in the future. I was wondering if maybe Pact is a good thing to use in this particular case, but I wasn't sure how it would work. The solution architect sort of mentioned, well, why don't you just create like a mock Kafka queue like you do with the mock server with HTTP? But there would be a problem with all the different types of message queues you then have to support. You'll have to have mock servers for them all. So a bit of thinking, went away on one weekend, I put together a prototype and managed to get something to work for that particular case. And I think that was a really important thing because it allowed Pact to branch out into a whole new direction where we were supporting asynchronous message flows, so not just HTTP. So that could have got us up to 2015 and so. But then we, as Beth mentioned, we sort of were having all these different problems. So we thought we needed a way to have the basic Pact logic in a central place because with the diaspora of Pact implementations, a lot of the time they could be just slightly different, and things could be surprising if someone's using one language and they got to use another language, and things work differently. So we thought about how would we be able to do sort of put this in, and we couldn't just let anyone do that. It seems that the actual core matching logic and verification logic is actually quite tricky to do. So you've got to actually think about it and plan it. So we had a sort of a bit of think, and then Rust was starting to gain a momentum at that point, and it seemed like a good language because it was designed to be integrated into other languages. It was one of the core features at Mozilla that they actually wanted to integrate it into Firefox and a lot of their C++ code. So this seemed like, well, that's good. If it's good for integrating into other languages, then it must be good for us. It was also memory safe and extremely performant, and has no memory garbage collection. So there's no additional threads running that need to clean up memory and stuff like that. So it seemed like a good idea. Of course, the real reason was somebody else wanted to do the same thing in Go. And I didn't really want it to support an implementation in Go, knowing that I'll probably have to do a lot of the code myself. So if I was going to be doing most of the work, I could at least have a choice in the language. So yeah, 2016, I started that project, got it going, sort of implemented all the new V3 things in it. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite achieved what we wanted because just maintaining, like the JVM takes a lot of my time. And so it's now only 2020, it's like 4 years later, we're actually starting to get it into other implementations with Pact.js and we've got Pact C++, which just started out with it. But yeah, not quite where we want it to be, but we're getting there.
Cool, thanks, Ron. So I'll just come back a slide there. So my name is Matt. I'm also one of the core maintainers. Pact Go is one of the ones I maintain, as well as Pact JavaScript and a few other things. So I want to talk about the next stage for Pact. So really, Pact defined contract testing. It really put contract testing on the map. Yeah, and its popularity is really only growing. For example, just last month, we had 800,000 downloads of our JavaScript library alone. Yeah, we know thousands of companies worldwide use contract testing because of Pact. And we're seeing really big companies like Tricentis, SmartBear, Postman, and others trying to get in on this game of contract testing, and which is a sure sign that it's really starting to disrupt the industry. We recently even had the product manager, API product manager from Tricentis, refer to us as best of breed, which is really heartening. And it's made its way into mainstream conferences and speaking circuits too. So for example, literally today, there are 2 separate talks about Pact at Angular conference in Poland, NG Poland, which is the biggest conference of its kind in Europe. So Pact really is growing up. However, like many first tools of its kind, we know it's not perfect, and there are things we can do and are doing to improve that. And as maintainers, what's the slides? Sorry, everybody. Going to share my screen again. Have they come back up, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, got some thumbs up there. Apologies for that. I can only see one screen. So look, as I said, like many first tools of its kind, we know it's not perfect and there's lots of things we're doing and we're going to continue to do to improve it. And as maintainers, we're constantly asking questions like, how can we disrupt Pact? How can we guarantee its future? So the first answer to that question is being able to spend more time contributing to Pact. And we've been putting our heads together, and a while back we posed this question: how might we create a profitable commercial entity that also moves Pact forwards? And so in November 2016, which is literally 4 years ago now, we launched our first experiment into that space. Our free hosted Pact broker service was what we called it, very creative. But by running and supporting that platform, we learned a lot about how our customers use Pact and evolve the ecosystem through that feedback. As you've heard, we've always built features into Pact because of experience and based on feedback, but this time we could get that feedback at a much bigger scale. And last year, alongside my co-founders Beth and Ron, we launched PactFlow, which is our commercial entity with a purpose to solve integration testing for enterprises and to scale the use of Pact in their organizations. We really feel that creating a commercial entity that depended on the success of Pact meant that it would get more attention and more attention that it needed. And happily, we're now starting to see the fruits of that labor. We're seeing some global partners, including VinityWorks, who saw the value in contract testing and were reaping benefits for their customers, and they're now part of the journey with us. And we've also been able to push many of the items on the open source Pact agenda more rapidly than previously, including the things Ron were talking about, releasing features such as pending and whip packs, which have really solved a lot of problems for a bunch of people and simplifying some workflows, XML support in JavaScript and Java, starting to move forward the V3 agenda with JavaScript and Go and others, as well as the addition of C++ as a new language. So, what's next for Pact? Well, there's really a few different goals. The first one is to be able to simplify adoption. So getting Pact into the hands of more people, making it easier for people to write Pact tests is a real key priority for us. So we know testers as well are a key demographic and they stand to benefit a lot from Pact testing, but traditionally it can be hard for them to get involved simply because it requires access to the code base. So we want to change this. We also want to enable more people to write tests through tools like Cypress, because we know that's going to reduce the barrier to entry and increase the ability for teams to adopt new ways of working. And integration with Swagger and Open API Spec is also high on the priority list, which gives you an idea of how we want to increase that adoption. The second thing is really increasing the breadth and depth of technology. We know architecture, technology, we know it's evolving, and Pact needs to evolve with it. So, for example, gRPC and protobufs are two really highly requested features that are on our backlog. And the last one there is growing our contributor base and nurturing our community. So Pact still remains a grassroots initiative, and while more commercial backing will provide further momentum for the project, we're really nothing without our community. So we want to grow that contributor base to get new features into more languages, improve the developer experience, and so on. So if you're interested later today, you'll hear from Elliot about how you might be able to help us do that. But lastly, we just need to keep investing in our communities, such as events like this, in our Slack workspace as well. We've recently actually hit a milestone of 2,000 users in that forum, and our focus has really started to result in a thriving and active community. For us, what we want to do is start to create more stories like this, where careers are being influenced or created by Pact. Processes are being transformed within organizations to create high-performing companies, or connecting to teams on the other side of the globe to learn about how they're using Pact and what we can do to improve the tools to make their jobs easier. So solving the big problems is really what got us interested in working with Pact in the first place. But it's really these experiences that just keep us motivated to carry on with our mission of transforming organizations, do their testing, and perform integration testing of their distributed systems. So I'd like to leave you with this little thing to reflect on. How can you be part of this journey going forwards?
Okay, thanks, Matt, for that. And Beth and Ron, I think it's really great to understand how things came into being. I know we get lots of questions about the Ruby engine, and Ruby's a sort of love-hate kind of thing, but hopefully now the context of why things are there. It's interesting to hear that it's a matter of how many years you have in the industry. There's still opinionated wars between now it's Rust and Golang. That's kind of an interesting little anecdote there from Ron, I thought. So that's great, kind of where we've come from to where we are. What we want to share next was how we use it or how we've managed to have success stories as the key maintainers. I guess if we can't eat our own dog food, there's that would be a bad sign. So I'm going to introduce next Tim Jones. So interesting anecdote about Tim Jones. We met in Sydney, I think working on a chatbot. That was a few years ago when I lived in Australia. And it turns out we were near neighbours in Cambridge at one stage. We didn't know. So it shows that, and it doesn't matter how big the world is, it is also a very small place. Now, Tim's an incredibly talented engineer, very smart guy, and I've been told to warn you that opinions lay ahead in his demo, and he wants to share how he does Pact. So, and I think there's around the flexibility of the tool and stuff, and his passion for that hopefully comes through. So I hand over. I'll stop talking. And I'll hand over to Tim.
Thanks, Elliot. So, as Elliot said, I'm Tim. I'm one of the maintainers for Pact.js and Pact Node. As Beth said earlier, with the whole Pact ecosystem, we've tried really hard to ensure that it works well in a variety of languages, plays nicely with other frameworks, and doesn't sort of hold too many opinions about how you write your code. Like if you want to use Pact to test an integration boundary, you should be able to do that. But as Elliot said, I'm excited to give this talk because it's sort of an opportunity to talk about things that I'd be uncomfortable putting into the documentation, because they're things that work well if your preferences in software design and construction and so on match mine. And I'm not saying that this is the right way to use Pact necessarily. There are lots of different ways to get value from our tooling. But I'm hoping to demonstrate some models and patterns that I found particularly useful. I know that some of these patterns are used by the other maintainers as well. And I also know that some of them would say, well, I wouldn't do it that way. So please don't take this as gospel. My hope is that you will find something useful in this talk that might work for you too. Or that if you don't, then I will learn something from the questions. So one of the things that often comes up is this sort of mantra we have that contract tests are not functional tests. And I want to sort of give a little bit of background for that example. So my favorite example for this is username validation. So if you say that your contract has a request which expresses, can you create a user with this username? And the provider might respond with two different responses. Maybe there's a positive one saying, yep, we're all good. And maybe there's a negative one saying, well, you can't have that username. There might be a number of possible reasons for this, like maybe the user Matt already exists, or maybe you can't have capital letters in the username, or any number of other reasons. But in this example, I just want to focus only on the negative examples. So for the sake of this example, let's say that the responses look the same from the perspective of the consumer. Maybe the response is the same structure, but a different message. So perhaps the username already taken returns a 400 with this message. For convenience, let's pretend that 409 conflict doesn't exist. Say that invalid characters returns a message like this. So from the perspective of the consumer, the Pact consumer test is saying, can I understand all of the different responses that I might receive for this request? Can I understand and handle them? To illustrate that a bit, I'm also going to show the flow of the test. So this is sort of the life cycle of a single interaction in a consumer test. So on the left-hand side here, we've got, we say, hey, I'm going to generate this particular request. And then you say, when the provider is in this particular state, I expect this particular response. Now, the parts the Pact framework does for you are sort of here in blue, and these are the parts that you have to do inside the unit test that you're running the test in. So to give a code example, in Pact.js, this is how we would say, well, when I receive a request that looks like this in this particular state, I expect a body that looks like this. So that each one of these maps to part of this setup. And the other half of that is the unit test that actually fires the request. Splitting that code out, we can see that this is where we fire the actual request. So this is with this, oh, I've written code, that's not right. With this, oh no, that is right, yes. With this particular function call is what I mean. This particular request is sent, and then Pact tests that that's what you said you would send, gives you the response you said you would expect, and then we confirm with assertions that we unmarshal into the expected response domain object for your calling code. A quick aside, in the JavaScript land, this object is often, almost always, exactly the same as the request that's on the wire, especially if they're JSON objects. So we actually have this helpful function called extract payload, which you can use to strip the packed matches off the request. I don't think this is the most descriptive name for this function. We are considering exporting it again with a name like strip matches, but we'll keep the existing one because like I don't want to sort of rename functions at the boundaries of the API and break stuff for everyone else. So this is the whole picture. The idea here is that if our consumer doesn't rely on the different ways the provider might say no, we only implement one test that covers the contract, but doesn't exercise all of the business logic in the provider, because the consumer doesn't know how the provider is implemented, so we don't want to be executing all of the different paths inside the provider. If the consumer were expecting a specific response, like maybe if there is we handle the, hey, that username is a conflict differently, and we actually rely on the explicit message, then rather than say, hey, I get an error which is a string, and here's an example, you would actually rely on the specific example. So the idea is that our tests just say, hey, this is what we expect. This is all the different types of responses that we expect to be able to understand, but we don't need to know why they might have been generated. So the code that's considered covered by Pact sort of sits across the boundary between the two, between the consumer and the provider. And the idea is that in the username validation example, the unit tests on the provider side would cover the business logic of, hey, what happens if there's a conflict? What happens if there's a special character? What happens if there's a space, etc. And this code is considered not under test by Pact. Zooming in a little bit, so to make the example more specific, say we had a React front end and maybe a Spring Boot backend. What's actually under test is the API layer inside the React front end. So ideally, that would be code that wouldn't touch any components, which would be called by, say, your hooks or your like thunks or whatever in React land. And similarly, on the back end, what's directly under test is the API controllers or any middleware or marshallers that are in there. We can make this a little bit clearer by sort of separating out the layers in the diagram, because when you're doing unit tests within sort of, I've written components here, but really just whatever your UI is, so your thunks, your actions, your the UI parts. And when you're doing the unit tests for this, you would mock along this boundary, and at some point over here, you do a mock in here when you're doing the verification on the provider side. So it's true that contract tests are not functional tests, and I think we've talked about that quite a bit. But it is still good if your tests have functional coverage. So what I mean by this is that tests exist as a risk reduction strategy. It's a strange position. It's a strange thing to say as a maintainer of a testing tool, but we don't actually need tests. Like, tests provide no value for the end users. What's happening is that tests are reducing the risk that we've screwed things up as developers and engineers. So I think it introduces additional benefit if we have a bit of functional coverage inside the tests. So the idea is not to intentionally drive functional testing with Pact, but to let it do some functional testing. I can explain what I mean with the previous diagram. So in this diagram, red is what's under test directly. So that's the stuff that we do want to exercise fully. But the question is, where do we mock in the provider when we're setting up provider state? So say, hey, the user mat already exists. We could let the entire provider code run, because at some point in this hypothetical example, at some point there is some code inside our provider which calls out to a repository. Perhaps that is like a database layer or something. So you could provide a mock database that fills in all of the, that has the data that the service relies on. If you do that, your test is going to need to know too much about the way that the repository is implemented. And it's going to be hard to maintain that mock alongside the Pact tests. It's nice because your state is ideally expressed quite simply, like, hey, there is a user called Matt, or there is not a user called Matt, and that we can implement that easily inside a mock that just speaks in that same language. We could mock the whole thing and just have the controllers. So your controller will make some service call, and that will return some business object that maybe it might throw in the event of a failure, or maybe it might return a business object that represents a failure in some way. That's fine, but so then if you do this, then your verification says, yes, I am capable of producing that type of response, but it doesn't say that it definitely will produce that type of response in that situation. So my preference is to put the mock still inside the provider, but as low down as is practical. So you can sort of view this sort of 3-layer provider picture as, this is the sort of entry point, this is the code that covers what it actually does, and this is the code that covers how it communicates with its downstream services, if any. And so if you can put the mock at this boundary in between the service and any downstream dependencies, so that this boundary speaks in terms of, hey, insert this user, please, and the repository says, yeah, I did that. Or, hey, does this user exist? And it says, no. Rather than like insert into table users, instead of speaking in that language, that translation boundary. This is useful. So I've colored the service in pink here because while it is run during the tests, it's not fully exercised, and it's definitely not the intention of the consumer test to exercise this code. A while back, I used to think that, and this means that your Pact tests will cover some of the same ground that your unit tests cover. And I used to hold the view that having multiple tests or multiple test suites covering the same code incidentally was bad, because when you got a failure, how would you know what caused the failure? Maybe this is obvious to others, but after a while, I realized that the answer to this is, it's the code you were just working on when the tests broke. So it's I think fine to cover the same code in multiple places. Like if your unit tests are passing and your Pact verification is failing because of something in the service, you have an additional layer of coverage, which I think is good. Separate topic. Another way that I like to use Pact is to connect the tests and the mock with fixtures. So looking at the other side of this picture, when you're doing component tests and you maybe inside your hook, you have a call to the API, you would mock that and say, well, the API returns this object. We have this problem in the JavaScript land that which you can mitigate a bit with TypeScript or Flow or something, but you still have this problem that what if the object that we are getting back from that we are asserting that we can generate with our Pact tests is not the object that we are asserting exists in the unit tests. So I think that in the unit test mock, I think that this problem you wouldn't have in the JVM or somewhere where you've got stronger types. But you can mitigate this with careful fixtures. So if you have, say, a fixtures file called something like, so this is a example test for the, I modified an example that was about addresses. This should say username.pact.fixtures. So these are the fixtures for the username file. So we have, this is the Pact expectation, and this is the business object, and they happen to be the same. So that in our Pact test, we can include what is, we can include the Pact version of it and expect that the business object comes out correctly. And this is another subtlety. I think I either got this from Andras or from Matt. I don't remember which, but if you name your Pact files differently to your other tests, then you can have your test suite run all of them by default, but you can choose to not run the Pact tests sometimes, which can be helpful if you've got very heavy sets of Pact tests. The other side of this, using the same fixtures, is wherever you need the mock, you can have the mock API, which just mocks the resolve value of the failure object. This pattern has prevented a large number of bugs for me, and I definitely recommend it. While putting this example together, I realized that actually isn't how I would typically write those fixtures. So a little more complex. You can export the object that will be responded with. So when you have a lot of these fixtures, you end up with a lot of similarly named things, and so you have to remember, well, what are the ones that are the business objects, what are the ones that are the Pact objects. But you tend to only need the Pact, or you only need the Pact objects, the Pact fixtures inside your Pact tests, but you end up often using the business objects fixtures in multiple different specs, if you've got multiple places where that API might be called from. So I find it helpful to export all of the Pact responses on one object. And then you can spread this like so, which I think is a little bit more readable. Now, there's an additional thing, which is that this is often repeated as well. And so you can pull out the, this is the name of this type of request, and you can pull that out to its own request object, which you might have inside your Pact file, Pact spec, sorry. And then your tests read much simpler. So you can say, hey, when I've got this request in this state, this is the response I have. And so your tests read, I think, much more logically. I wanted to make a contentious claim, which is that as APIs have become more, I guess, like almost all products expose some sort of REST API. And this pattern of putting like /v1 or /v2 in a URL is quite common. And so the reason I think it might be an anti-pattern is that as you go through your source tree and you have these v1 and v2 endpoints, and at some point both live together, and there's a question about which version of this v1 is there. So you need to have a definition of breaking change. And normally these are sort of removal of a field or renaming a field. Maybe some of those changes aren't breaking because, for example, in Pact, we specify the minimum request. So maybe the full, minimum response. So maybe the full response actually looks like this, but our consumer doesn't use any of it. So removing those things isn't breaking. Also, what happens if, say, a field was present, but by mistake? So it's a subtle bug that gets fixed. In here, they realize, oh, well, we were producing an array of objects and it had too many things in it, so we're going to remove some of them. Like, is a bug fix then a breaking change? It becomes quite a bit harder. This diagram is from the versioning documentation. So by far the leakiest part of Pact is that it places constraints on your version scheme. So we can't use whenever we change the Pact, we need to have a version which goes straight to a particular, we need to be able to have a version of the software that can label a particular Pact. And what's nicest is if we were able to say, hey, for each commit, we have a version. What often happens is people use build numbers for the versions, but that's a source of pain because sometimes it's harder to reason about. It's a layer of indirection you have to go and look up. And sometimes a commit from the past might be the latest build number because maybe it got rebuilt or something. And also what happens if you switch build systems? Semver can sort of help with this. So for a valid Semver, we're allowed to put extra information on the end. So this is a nice solution to this problem, where you can say, so we can include extra information separated by dots in the pre-release information, and this is the way that I like to do it. So if you have a tag on your commit history, you can say what your version is, but for the ones in between, you can also give them a full unique version string. So what this says is, this is the branch that this was on. This is the number of commits since the last tag. And this is the git char, just as a disambiguation, because maybe there's another, another first commit on master somewhere else that hasn't been merged yet. There's also an additional bit of build metadata, which you can use if your local machine, if your local Git instance is dirty, which is quite helpful for, like, if you are allowing people to deploy or to run tests locally and that it's happening during development, this can tell you that this is a version that you can't reason about very easily. So the last thing that happens, it was after a while of using Pact, I wrote to Beth and I said, hey, I'm starting to think that all tests are actually contract tests. Is this what you think as well? And Beth was like, yes. So if you have some module test for, like, I don't know, something that you can test with just straight up unit tests, maybe inside it might use some other modules or some other classes or whatever, and you can mock those out completely. But if you do that, then you end up needing to know how to fill in those holes when you run the test. To borrow the coloring in example from before, it's good to have some coverage, but not to exercise fully the code inside, because we don't know what the implementation is. An advantage of thinking about it this way is that if the internal implementation of the module changes, then you don't need to know. So you can use the same tests that you use to test this one as to test this one as to test this one. And that your test says, in this state, if I send this method call, I expect this response. And that is the same structure that we have in Pact. I have this question, which is, if I were not a maintainer, what would I like to ask the maintainers for? I would like to be able to configure Pact.js easier. So at the moment, we end up with multiple specs because it's helpful to be able to split out the specs so you have all of your errors in one place and all of your successes in one place, and then maybe you have separate files, separate versions of both of those for different endpoints, just to avoid having a test file which is thousands of lines long. And then it would be nice if we could more easily share the config across all of those things, because they all have the same consumer. Better errors from Pact.js. This is, as Beth spoke about earlier, this is something that is a side effect of having the Ruby CLI back Pact.js. And it's something that the Rust implementation will help solve. And I think it would be useful if we integrated an easy way to get versions from your source, because you might not want to, you might not have an opinion on the versioning scheme to use for Pact. And so it would be nice if we could just say, just use one out of the box that just worked. Put a bit of a summary here. I try not to drive functional coverage with a Pact test, but I do think it's good if there are some functional coverage. Fixtures are a really good way to tie your API layer mocks to your actual API tests. So Pact says, when I send this request, I can get this response and generate this business object. And then you take that business object and you use it in any other test code where the API is mocked. I try to version the consumers and the providers from source code so that it is much easier to reason about the version changing, and that all tests are really contract tests at the end of the day. The questions that I'm most interested in is, what would you like to ask the maintainers for? And what patterns do you use that others might find helpful? And what I mean by what would you like to ask us for is not just things like, oh, it would be nice if there were deeper Swagger integration, which is still great to hear. But just the small things like, man, like this element of the DSL is annoying, and it would be nice if it wasn't. That's something that I'm personally quite interested in. And as Elliot said, it's a great time to help as well. So like if there's in the last several months, we've had so many even just documentation fixes, which is very helpful. So if people would like to contribute, we would definitely welcome that.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. Lots of really great content there. I really loved actually the diagram you had. I think that really illustrates, when you design a test strategy, where you cut off and where you cut in with the Pact stuff and the overlap with unit tests. I think that visual I found really helpful. And a bit about, worrying about if you're over testing. I'm always reminded of Martin Fowler quote about when they're talking about classic mock-in versus different sort of mock-in strategies you can use in unit tests. His idea was, well, it's okay if it's better to test it a little bit more than test a little bit under, so if you get to that kind of point, you're having that sort of conversation. So I think, that sort of, with the illustrations you had there, that's, some sort of takeaway. So we have gone through, lots of details here on how a maintainer uses this and how they think about their mental models of actually implementing Pact. But now I'm going to bring Anto into the conversation, and he's going to talk more about the organizational challenges that we see with people adopting it, because often it's not the technical, it's actually getting people's buy-in to actually start using Pact. So a little bit about Anto. I say he's from Treatwell, who are sponsoring us today. So great shout out to them. He's a coach and a technologist based in London. So there's two of us in the UK, the rest are all in Melbourne. So just point out, so we're representing the GMT crew. So he's got a long history, about 15 years in agile, quality, testing, automation across lots of different companies, and really has seen the benefits of Pact in driving CI/CD. He's been a JVM contributor for quite a while now, but I think actually recently he's been just more across the whole community. And I personally, I think for the rest of the maintainers as well, I don't think we would be doing this today without Anto. It would just be one of those threads in Slack that went to thread Slack heaven or something. So personally, I want to sort of thank him for giving us the impetus to actually do today. So with that said, I'm going to, first off, we're going to do a bit of a Q&A. If there's any questions that we don't answer to go through, please, as with Tim's, put them in Slido and we'll try and get them answered at the end. So Anto, tell us a bit about yourself. What did I cover? Tell us a bit about Treatwell. What do we need to know?
Yeah, hi everyone. I think your introduction was perfect, so I'm not going to say anything more about myself. But a bit about Treatwell. Treatwell is a marketplace for booking hair and beauty, and it's really the leader across Europe. It's present in more than 10 countries, but it's not just a marketplace because it also offers SaaS products that our partners can use to manage their salon. And in terms of technology, the size of the team is about 120 people who are split between the UK and Lithuania. We have about a dozen cross-functional delivery teams, each team with their own product mission. We have most of our backend, if not all of our backend, written in Java. Our front end is written in React with TypeScript. And we also have mobile apps for both our marketplace and supplier sides. There's also a bit of Python in the data analytics side of things. And Treatwell was founded in 2008. It had a different name back then. It's gone through a series of acquisitions and integrations. And so, as you can imagine, we have a mix of newer and older software. And I imagine I'll probably tell you a bit more about that later.
Cool. And how did you get to learn about Pact personally?
So my first encounter with Pact was when I did some consulting for a UK company called Rightmove. They were at the initial stages of developing their first ever microservices. And therefore, they were also trying to figure out what testing approaches would be more aligned with their architectural vision. And I was there to help with those questions. And even before I started working for them, they'd already looked into consumer-driven contracts as a pattern. And that was in 2014. So as we were saying earlier in the keynote, Pact was at the very early stages of development. And the team that I was working with, which was the team working on these first microservices, did a few spikes around Pact. I think they also tried Pacto, which I think died since then, but they decided to go ahead with Pact and adopt it as their tool of choice to do contract testing and system integration testing. And I believe they still use Pact. I think Matt might know a bit more about this. But bear in mind that some of the challenges for which we have better answers and support in terms of tooling today had not been fully figured out back then. So really, they were early adopters back in 2014.
Cool. So they were microservices with a hyphen back then. Cool. So why did you? So you obviously moved to Treatwell. Why did you think it was a good fit for where you work now?
Well, now let's fast forward to 2017. So I joined Treatwell to help with, broadly speaking, similar challenges to the ones that Rightmove was facing in 2014. And fundamentally, there was a question around how to create a test strategy that would be aligned with the overall tech strategy. And in this, there were two main driving factors. One was that it was a desire to deliver more frequently and with a shorter lead time. And also we wanted to start moving away from a monolith to a distributed architecture of applications that could be developed and also deployed independently from each other. And this was going to be a very different approach from the approach that Treatwell had adopted up until then. As I mentioned, we had a monolith, so most of the backend logic was within this monolith. And yes, there were some applications that were separate from this monolith, most of the sort of mobile and front-end clients, but these were tested and released all together with the backend every 2 weeks. And at this stage, we knew that this wasn't going to scale, and it also didn't seem to make sense in relation to the direction that we wanted to set out. And so we knew that if we wanted to release our existing and new services independently from each other, we needed a way to also test them independently, or at least as independently as possible. And specifically, we wanted to know whether it would be safe to deploy any service or application to production whenever we wanted. And so even if all these applications had the most comprehensive test coverage, they could still break when integrating with all the other applications that they collaborate with. So in Pact terms, this would be their consumers and their providers. So an obvious way of solving this integration challenge would have been to take all these applications and test it together. Whether through a continuum of, let's say, better and worse approaches, from deploying everything onto environments and test them all together, to use containerization to spin subset of this application, and perhaps other ways of creating sort of permutation of very different versions of these applications. And then let's say there was Pact as an option, which pretty much allows you to do the same thing, which is to test the integration between applications and their contracts, but with unit tests. And so just really to answer your original question, it seemed a pretty good fit because we thought that it would allow us to start working on some of this integration testing straight away, but also minimizing the amount of coupling between applications and avoid what I call integrated tests.
So with these integrated tests, these were the problems that you thought Pact was really going to kind of address and allow you to get to, reducing the time between deploys? And it was a good fit for? Yeah,
definitely, yes.
Okay, cool. So adopting Pact, we often see requires a lot of investment. There tends to be learning, not just for individuals, but for organizations, how to use it. So being a relatively early adopter, how did you go about this at Treatwell? How do you get to a point where it's been successful?
So it was definitely a journey. And I think I can identify 3 main stages. So the first stage was really focused on proving the value that Pact could offer and try to answer some of the basic questions on how to use it. So it was really a platform to learn more about Pact. And so it was all about some initial spiking and finding some early adopters within the company, and ultimately using Pact to solve some real challenges, but within a limited scope. So for example, we had a team who were among the first ones who were focusing on creating some brand new services separate from the monolith. And I worked quite closely with them to figure out together how to use and roll out Pact within their domain. And this was a team that enthusiastically took on this challenge, and both they and I learned a huge amount. And if it hadn't really been for the hands-on work with that team, I think even my knowledge wouldn't have grown as much as it did. And so stage 1 was all about initial experimentation and early adopters.
So yeah, we hear that a lot, that getting that exemplar team to get going is a really good way to get started. But how did you then progress it from there?
So then let's say that was this, what I call stage 2, which was more about setting out our strategy for continuous delivery and how automated testing would help us with that. And this is when, as a tech organization, we decided to use OKRs to help articulate better our future vision and also start taking tangible steps towards it. And one of these steps involved in these initial stages of our OKR process was to increase the confidence in our test approach. And to achieve that, we got together a group of engineers from different teams, and we wanted to better understand and define together how we wanted to do automated testing. So through this exercise, we achieved 2 things. So the first one is that we involved a relatively large number of engineers, a good representation. And so this led to better answers and a wider buy-in. And secondly, specifically in relation to Pact, we really wanted to, we ended up making a statement around why Pact and why its role would be so critical to our overall success. So stage 2 really helped us with confidence and articulation, and also it made sure that we could converge towards a unified way of seeing testing.
Okay, so we see this a lot around spreading the knowledge and building capability internally. So you've got a good group now. How did you spread that further throughout the organization?
So by the end of stage 2, then the adoption of Pact has started to bleed out of those teams of early adopters. But unfortunately, with that, also, we started to experience a few pain points. And fundamentally, we had just not invested enough in creating a seamless experience for developers when it came to using Pact. And so here comes stage 3, which was when we decided to focus on education, which meant acknowledging that sometimes understanding Pact requires time, and you shouldn't be concerned if it takes some effort for people to grasp it. So what we did is that we surveyed all our delivery teams to find out more about their feelings around Pact and their experience. And this helped us massively, because from that, we realized what the main points were, what the main pain points were, and also what we could do about them. So ultimately, this led to creating a small group of people, which we call test ops, that could help with addressing some of this feedback. And this small team focused on improving awareness and understanding of Pact across the tech organization, but also some tangible initiatives like setting best practices, improving our tooling and our pipelines, and ultimately really making it easier for teams to write Pact tests and getting the feedback that they wanted to get out of these tests. And I'd probably say that stage 3 is really not over. And I'm not sure if it will ever be, as there will always be, as we've seen even in the last hour, better ways of doing some of the things we are already doing now.
It's always a journey, right? So
Yeah.
to get an idea of scale, how many participants and integrations do you have at the moment? And I'm going to explain participants as the number of providers or consumers, and integration is the number of contracts or packs. How many do you have currently in Treatwell?
So I asked this question at Pact Broker this morning, and it came back telling me that we have 66 participants and 124 integrations. Now, these 66 participants, so this does not mean that we have 66 independent services, because some of these participants, for example, sit within our monolith, even if they are separate web applications. And also, as some of you may know, currently you need to separate your HTTP and your ANQP interactions. And so some of our services need to have 2 participants to account for that. But let me show you a graph that I thought was quite interesting. So here you can see the number of participants over time for us at Treatwell. And so I think this starts from the beginning of 2018 and of 2017 up until a few months ago. And so you can see that towards the end of 2019, there was a definite increase. And this was in between stage 2 and 3 that I mentioned earlier, where the efforts that we put in translated into a wider adoption of Pact.
Wow, we're really seeing the growth there. That's really great to see. And I guess the key sort of metric that we kind of get to with your OKRs, how often do you deploy currently?
So I'll show you a graph with some numbers on that as well, but let me tell you just a little story. I mentioned that we use OKRs in tech, and our most important objective, which has been the same since we started working with OKRs, is deliver smaller and more frequent releases of independently deployable applications. And when we decided to start this OKR journey, we were doing releases only every 2 weeks. And anything that was outside of that cycle was usually an urgent bug fix. So off the back of this objective, for a few quarters, we had some key results focused on increasing the frequency of our deployments. And we went from deploying every 2 weeks. So that would be an average of twice a month, perhaps a bit more if we had hot fixes, to over 20 releases a month. And from then, things have improved even further. And this graph shows the number of deployments per week in the last 3 months. So you can see that we've gone from deploying twice a month in 2018, 2019, to actually releasing on average 45 times every week. And this is across all our services. So this is not just about the monolith anymore, but all the various independent services that we have.
That's really impressive growth. So I saw Tim talk earlier about how he thinks about the boundaries for Pact tests. Can you share your testing strategy with us more generally? And I'm going to put this in there, the controversial question we have to ask: does this include any end-to-end tests?
Well, how much time have we got? Just kidding. So I think I've already given away a bit of this. It would take a considerable amount of time to go through it in detail, but I'll give you two of the most salient points of our strategy. So the first one is that we want to be able to look at the pipeline of any of our applications and make a decision on whether we can release or not just based on that pipeline. And this is really a foundational element of continuous delivery. So we haven't really made it up ourselves. But this means that we definitely need an exhaustive and comprehensive automated test coverage for all our applications. And the second point is that we have a strong bias towards small tests and pre-deployment tests versus large and post-deployment ones. And these two principles are very much aligned with the Pact philosophy. So first of all, with Pact, we can do integration testing at build time without having to deploy onto our test environments. And secondly, we also have all the information that we need in our pipeline thanks to Can I Deploy? So you asked me about end-to-end tests. Back in the days, we used to have a few, and pretty much they were the only automated tests that we had. For various reasons, they didn't survive the test of time. So we have none of those at the moment, which is actually a bit problematic for some of our applications, especially the ones that live inside our monolith. So as I said before, we have a bias towards smaller non-integrated tests. And the theory is that if we have excellent test coverage that does not cross the system boundaries, plus various forms of stubbing, whether it's of APIs or databases of queues, plus Pact, then we won't need end-to-end tests. Or if we do, perhaps we'll need just a few, maybe in the form of journey tests, as Sam Newman calls them, which would constitute a way of smoke testing the entire platform, maybe even a way of doing semantic monitoring. And actually, given that I'm mentioning monitoring, our test strategy is heavily intertwined with how we want to do telemetry and specifically monitoring and alerting. And sorry.
I was say yes, it's a hot topic.
Yeah,
that's a hot topic. It's telemetry. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. No, I was just saying that one more thing, which is what I think Tim made quite clear earlier, is that we want to keep Pact tests for what they should be, which is to test that contract and integration between services, and not the functional logic of the providers. So we want to write specific tests for that and avoid bloating Pact with unnecessary tests. If we then get some of the sort of side effects that Tim talked about, that's a bonus, but we definitely don't want to pollute the space with the unwanted functional tests.
Yeah, cool. I love the bias for small tests. That's a really good kind of North Star. So I know speaking to you, you have a bit of a novel approach to Pact and CI/CD, partly due to when you start adopting Pact. Can you share that with us and the wider audience? Yeah,
definitely. So the main difference is that we, from a more traditional workflow, is that we don't use the Pact brokers webhooks. So when we did that survey that I mentioned about earlier, one of the most common pieces of feedback that we received from our teams was that it was very annoying when either intentionally or unintentionally a change to a consumer leading to a change in a Pact would break the provider's pipeline. And I don't think that this is a problem unique to us. But when I was discussing with my colleagues quite some time ago, I remembered how gov.uk, who are also heavy adopters of Pact, decided to, as a pattern, run the provider tests of a provider in the pipeline of their consumer. To make it a bit clearer, if service A is your consumer and service B is your provider, in the pipeline of service A, you would run the provider test of service B against the Pact just published by service A. And this is nothing more than shifting left what would happen with webhooks. And I will show you an example in a second, which I think will make it easier to understand. But before I do that, I just want to mention that there are now other ways of solving the problem of breaking the provider's pipeline. The pending pacts and work in progress pacts features that are available for the broker and for some of the pact implementations definitely help with that. But in our case, our pattern works well for us, especially because some of our consumers have many providers, and managing the webhooks would potentially require a bit of overhead. So our option really gives us the flexibility, that we enjoy, and also better visibility of failures. So I said that I would show an example, but before that, just let me give a bit of background on what I'm going to be showing. So in this diagram, you can see 5 applications and their relationships. These are, it's not a real example, but it's kind of like a simplified example. So the protagonist here is the Marketplace API. So the Marketplace API is both the consumer and the provider. And it's a provider for an iOS and Android app, and a consumer for a review service and an account service. So if you are familiar with GitLab CI, you probably recognize the Git.ci pipeline here. The headings on the top are called stages. The rounded rectangles underneath the stages are called jobs, and each stage can have a number of jobs that run in parallel. On the left, you can see some straightforward stages to build and test. And then you can see a stage called Pact compatibility with, and a few jobs under that. So the first job, which is Pact compatibility with consumers, is nothing particularly innovative, except for perhaps its name. This is where we run the provider test on Marketplace API, and they tell us whether Marketplace API is compatible with its master and prod version of the iOS and Android apps. The other 4 jobs underneath instead tell us whether, so we know we have 2 providers, review and account. And so we want to make sure that Marketplace API is compatible with both the master and prod versions of these 2 providers. So we've written some scripts that effectively check out the version of a provider that we want and run the provider tests and against the pact that Marketplace would have just published in this pipeline. And there's also a little trick that saves us quite a bit of time, which is that we call can I deploy before attempting to run these tests. And can I deploy lets us know whether we actually need to run them or not. This is also something that the Pact Brokers webhooks give you for free if you're using them. And actually, I think, no, I thought yes, here you can see actually on line 62 how we do our versioning, just referring to what Tim was talking about earlier. So just an idea. And did we use actually this versioning strategy and not just for our pacts, but as versions for the actual applications.
Awesome. That's great to see some of the internals. It's pretty involved. I see pipeline you've got set up there. Would you say that generally the organization sees the benefit in adopting Pact?
I'd say yes, for sure. I think it's difficult to quantify how much return on investment we're getting, but there are a few important considerations. So the first one is that Pact has encouraged collaboration in API and event design within teams and across teams, and generally speaking, more awareness around breaking changes and what you need to do to be able to deploy independently. It also helped us put extra focus on testing in general, and the role of engineers and teams in testing, which is really a critical aspect for a continuous delivery direction. And also, I really don't know how we would get any kind of reassurance around deploying independently if we're not using Pact. the effort required by any other approach and the risk of doing nothing, I think, constituting a good enough justification and return on investment for Pact. And then the last thing is that, as you can see here, this shows the trend in numbers of deployments and lead time for changes. So lead time for changes is effectively the time that it takes for a commit to be deployed to production. So whilst it's difficult to say how much Pact contributes directly to having made that possible, I'm pretty confident in saying that without Pact, it would be much harder.
Okay, awesome. And just to wrap up, what are the main lessons that you've learned? It sounds like you've had a lot of successes, but what are things that have tripped you up and you do differently if you were to adopt Pact at a new organization today?
Well, I think I'll tell you what I think would help people in their adoption, and perhaps we can leave what we would do differently another time when we have more time. But I think there are what I've listed down here as 7 tips from me. So the first one is that getting Pact right requires effort, and the whole space can be a bit complex. But I think that investing time in teaching people and being patient pays off. So questions will sometimes come up more than once, and you might think that you have the right approach, and later on you realize that it wasn't the best approach, and you'll have to change it or refine it. So, and if you're not doing that, it's probably a bad sign. Then the second point is around making sure that the value of Pact is understood and aligned with your overall vision. I think you really want to maximize the amount of promoters and minimize the amount of detractors. Therefore, getting people fully on board is critical for its success. Then I would say find some allies and ideally some experts in the organization early on that can help drive things forward. And related to that, I'd say create learning feedback loops like we did with our survey at some point. So listen to what your engineers are saying, don't piss them off. If something's not working quite right, try and do something about it rather than ignore it. Then I think it's linked to that, to these learning loops. I would say establish patterns collaboratively. It's important to engage with your internal community in your organization, not just to educate them, but also to kind of to put your brains together and make the best possible decisions together. Point 6, which I think you guys have made already before, it's like exploiting the community, the wider Pact community, the availability of the maintainers and all the amazing people behind Pact. Everybody's super friendly and very responsive. And it's rare that if you ask a question or raise an issue, whether it's on Slack or GitHub, you get ignored. So take advantage of that. And finally, I say the last point is that if you don't have any Pact expertise in-house, it might be a good idea to also consider getting some perhaps specialized support, either from the guys behind PactFlow or one of the partners, or just simply really leveraging on the community, as I mentioned earlier.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, never piss your engineers off, that goes without saying. But I love all the bits about the feedback loops and stuff like that. So thank you, Anto. As usual, if you've got any questions about this or anything else generally, you can ask Anto and Sido, and we'll try and feed that back into the Q&A session at the end. Okay. So I think I'm up next. So I'll just wait for Matt to do his magic. Awesome. So my talk's going to be a little bit shorter, but basically I think you've heard a bit of a theme today, and that's basically this. We really wanted to do, as well as like sharing with you, and we're going to have a session now after this that's going to get feedback from you. We also want to encourage some participation actually within Pact. So Beth mentioned this in the keynote. Pact's a fairly unusual open source project. These are what I would call the first-class citizens in our ecosystem, first-class languages and runtimes in our ecosystem. Some of these are a little bit more first class than others. That we've had JVM, Node.js, and Ruby are clearly, I guess the pristine ones. But these, I would say, all have near fully featured implementations. But there's still lots of gaps just within these. I know, being the Python maintainer, I'm very aware of things that I haven't done. And there's there's also ones out there that we have barely touched, but it's either a very skeleton implementation or nothing at all. So quickly going through them: Dart, top left; C++, Haskell for the hipsters; Rust, I'm sure Ron will fix that at some point from what he was saying earlier today; Perl, and Elixir. I'm not sure Haskell or Elixir, which one's hipsters, but anyway, I'm not sure. I don't think there's actually anything for Elixir. So there's still a large space out there that we just can't cover. So if you're a developer and you've got a passion for one of these languages, that's a really good way to get involved. And on top of that, the ecosystems for each of those languages is itself massive. So I was just trying, just for the Python one itself, and I should just add that I actually took on the maintainer role just to teach myself Python and become more proficient. It was actually my own self-benefit and obviously giving back to the community. But then I became aware of all these things you need to know about Python because, well, there's a whole bunch of web APIs on the left, and I only knew the first 3 or 4. We've obviously got a series of unit test frameworks and everything else that goes around it. And then you have to add this to Java and JavaScript and Ruby and everything else out there. And on top of that, we have more sort of meta level stuff. And we've seen a lot of conversations about this today about protocols and paradigms. So obviously Pact is a HTTP first framework. I think it was Ron and a couple others talked about sort of messaging today. And I think I mentioned like things like gRPC. And then we've got formats. We've got things like AWS and Lambda. How do you do tests for that? So there's a whole bunch of things that we have to cover. And we're seeing the messaging, streaming, I think even event sourcing. I don't think we've really even touched that yet as a contract-based testing paradigm. And we've got some use cases for this, and we've got some tooling, but there's a whole lot of extra support we could do about that. And on top of that, we've heard things like Pact Broker and Can I Deploy, and people are using it. We have some various Docker images, and we also have the docs, which I'm going into. So there's a little bit for every sort of engineer out there to get involved, and you don't even have to be an engineer. The docs as well, which I'll get to, also need some support. So if that's inspired you and you've decided that you want to get involved and you want to contribute, so just some sort of housekeeping, how to go about it. It's all the Pact stuff follows a very standard open source sort of model. If you go to Pact Foundation, I'm going to show this is Pact Ruby because Beth does an excellent job at keeping this really well tended. And the usual way of committing code is to fork and then do a pull request back in. But a couple of things to note about how we generally run our repos. First is obviously we're good citizens, so we have CI/CD. We are running on Travis, though we're seeing GitHub workflows become more and more adopted, and there's some issues around where Travis is going, but there is CI/CD, so your PR will have to pass that. So do read the README, if I have to say that, but yes, read the README. Documentation examples. Typically, most of the repos will have a great examples folder. So this is twofold: one, for you to learn, and two, there's always gaps. So I know in the Python, I've only really got a Flask one. I'm pretty close to having a fast API one, but there's a whole bunch of other examples where people are using. If you think you've got one, you can bring that in. We typically tie our examples up to CI, by the way, just so you know. We have issues. So interesting thing about this. So issues in the GitHub repos, we are typically using for sort of the language or the library specific things, and they tend to be tweaks. So that's a good place to go get started. You'll often see a great starter one. So if we try and label that, so if you do want to get interested, which reminds me I need to go do that for Python. But the more long-term stuff, we were talking about like things like gRPC and protobufs as a good example is on pact.canny.io. So you can go there and you can suggest and you can upvote, and this is helping drive our sort of wider roadmap. Okay. Now you've got a commit ready to go. Just a bit, just for your information, we've got typically you might see a roadmap and a releasing document. The releasing one is, I guess, just for your information. More interesting is the changelog and contributing. So if you go through the contributing, you'll see that we follow the conventional changelog. It nearly slipped my mind, got back there. In terms of our commits and also for our PRs. If maybe you work in a corporate and you don't know what conventional changelog is, it's just the way you annotate your commits. There's a convention, so you can see here we've got chore and then in brackets release. You don't actually need the release. That was a bit of extra context that's been put in. Fix security. There is tooling. Different repos have slightly different tooling adopted, but it all follows pretty much the same convention. I've put a link here to Commitison, which I think is in the Node and JavaScript ones. I'm not sure if it's in the Ruby one. I know in Python I've got something very slightly different. And they're typically enforced at the GitHub workflow. So you have to have it. If you don't have a PR, you're kind of fallible. So just be aware that you'll need to at some point do that. The docs we mentioned, so that is also a GitHub repo. You could just come in and add and contribute to this. You can fork pretty simply in the same way. We're using under the hood a tool called Docusaurus, which me and Beth recently upgraded the version 2. So I've got a version 1 screenshot here. Unfortunately, I realized after I'd done it. Now, Docusaurus is a static website generator, and it's got this format called MDX, which is this combination of Markdown and React. So if you're a front-end ninja, you can come in. You can see there's a few pages in our migration that I've broken. And when I asked Beth if she wanted to help, wanted to fix the styling on it, I think her comment was, do I look like a front-end engineer? We do need some help in this space and make it look a little bit snazzier, and there's also just more content. So I think there's a little bit for everyone, and also just great use cases as well. So that's all just contributing actual source code or documentation. But we also have all the socials, so come join us on Slack. I'll put the link up if you don't have it at the end of this talk, but it's all over all the documentation anyway. Stack Overflow, we typically have a few people curating and trying to answer that. I'm guilty of not doing as much of that as I should, but certainly in the Slack, we're pretty quick at trying to respond to most requests. Dev.to, if you want to blog, we'll certainly help retweet and promote, and if you want us to review it as well, I'm pretty sure you'll find someone to do it. And we're obviously in, the worst year ever, so it's like, we can't actually physically meet anyone. But at some point, we will actually go to do meetups again. So if you are actually running it, but also you can do something like this, a virtual thing. And I'll say we've got a grand plan of trying to do an in-person thing next year. And part of this experiment today was seeing what the appetite was for. So, and then finally, I just want to finish. I've kind of rattled through that pretty quick, so I know you want to get to the more interesting stuff, the Q&A. But whatever commit or whatever thing you contribute, thank you. You contribute to the community, no matter how small or how large. And appreciate in advance all the stuff that you give, and making the world just by one small step at a time a little bit of a better place. So awesome. So hopefully we'll get more of you who want to join and get some reward out. I personally have got a lot back out of it. I've learned, and also just that of giving back to open source that I've used for years. So and it's a kind of a ready-made community. So we are going to move on to the Q&A. So I've got to go back and quickly just go through curate some of your questions as we go through. But if you don't have the link, again, you should just be able to point your camera at that and it will take you to the Slido. More generally, what we can't answer today, we will try either via Pact Up, or you can join us on the Slack conversation. So we're not going to be able to get through everything, I don't think, because I can see already when I was looking a little bit earlier, there's quite a few questions. But it's your opportunity to ask any one of the panel, or the whole panel, any questions or any issues that you have. So I'm going to start with, I know this one catches a lot of people out. So around provider states, this confuses a lot of people. What are your tips for effectively writing it? What are they there for? What's sort of any best practices? Who wants to take that one on?
Well, I guess I'll jump in
Beth?
with one. I'm the reason that provider states exist, so I feel some responsibility for answering this one. So provider states were introduced fairly early on in the piece, when I realized that when we were doing our verification step, and even in the consumer side, if you didn't have a way to change the state of the provider, you were going to be missing code paths in your code. For example, if you're making a request, you might expect a 200, but your code also might need to handle a 404 or a 500, or even various different bodies of 200 for polymorphic resources. So we needed a way to be able to say, given that the provider has this particular data set up or has this particular state, then when we run this request, we expect this data to come back. So the provider state lets us run a hook to set up or mock the data that we need so that the response that we get back looks the way that we expect. Now, the way I personally like to do my provider states, now I know this is not going to be relevant for everyone because
Ruby's awesome.
Ruby
is that what you're going to say,
not
Beth?
that common at the moment. But I'm mostly a Ruby developer, and it's what I'm familiar with. So I'm going to show you how I manage my provider states in Ruby. If Matt doesn't mind just popping my screen up. All right, I like to make the data setup as easy as possible. So I actually write a test data builder for each provider project that I'm on that allows me to use a fluent DSL to really easily create the domain objects that I need to set up for each state. Now, I tend to not stub out the repository, but that's probably because the services that I've worked with typically tend to be genuinely microservices. They're pretty light. They're usually ones where I can run the database locally, like SQLite, Postgres. They're pretty easy to set up. They're easier to set up than to mock. So this technique wouldn't necessarily work if you were setting up mock data, but perhaps you could use the same pattern to set up mock data as well. So this is, hopefully you can see clearly, I've got my provider state described, and then my provider state here, consumer 1 and consumer 2 have 2 pacts with provider 1. So I just keep adding on data, and because this test data builder holds state, I can keep adding new domain objects in that can connect to each other. So it makes it really easy to set up states very quickly with very little overhead in your actual code. So you can see this is the provider states file for the Pact between the Pact broker and the Pact Ruby implementation. So we do dog food our own code. But as you can see, that's not particularly onerous. I'd love to hear from some other people who have providers in different languages, though. Anybody else?
It might be interesting to hear, Matt, about so it's not so much about the provider states, but you've got that authentication filter in JavaScript, which I've got an action to implement in Python as well, because that plays on the same idea, like the idea of how do I set up authentication, for example.
Yeah, I think zooming back out a little bit, like the main challenge here is not, I guess thinking about the provider states itself is kind of really zooming in. But the problem we're trying to solve here is we're trying to work around the problem of end-to-end test, where you're deploying into an end-to-end environment, and that environment has to have all the components deployed into it, all the data in it. It has to have all the right versions of the configuration on the server, all those things, right? And we know that that's a really expensive thing to do. So I guess right off the bat, provider states aren't necessarily the easiest thing to wrap your head around when you're brand new to this. I still remember my first experience with provider states, and I literally avoided using them for about 2 months, I think, until it was just pretty clear I needed to do it. But once you start to think about it that way, I think you realize what you're trying to do. And all you're really trying to do is just get your data, your application into a state that will be able to respond back given a particular scenario. So a user exists, I need to be able to respond to that. A user doesn't exist, I need to be able to respond to that. So just generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. Zooming in a bit more in terms of how to get things done, the real assumption under the hood here is that when you're doing the provider verification, you really have good control over the environment. And I know Tim and I here, we absolutely disagree sometimes around how to do provider verification, and that's totally fine. The point is, this is a framework and you can choose your own adventure. So I tend to be more probably a bit like Beth. I prefer my provider test to be so it's actually probably confusingly described. I would call them what I think are referred to in the Martin Fowler blog as a hermetic server, or kind of like a black box server. So you actually stand up your service in a black box type environment, but you stub out all the external systems. It doesn't go outside of your box. You can't go and talk to other APIs. The database layer is something that's a bit up for question. You can do it in memory. You can use Docker. They're really equivalent as far as I'm concerned. Where I differ probably a little bit with Tim, for example, is I prefer to do it within a test context. And then within the test context, you can use your standard mocking tools. So in JavaScript, you can use Jest, you can use Sign-In. In Java, you can use Mockito, whatever you want. And that really makes doing what Beth's talking about really straightforward. The alternative approach is really where you don't run your provider side tests in a test context, in the sense where it's being run through something like JUnit or Jest. It's being stood up separately. And really, you're trying to verify it from the outside. And again, it's just going to require your ability to be able to manipulate how the provider sees the universe at that moment in time. And if you're deploying into a real environment to do that test, it can be very difficult. And that's where I see most people, I guess, tripping over themselves.
I think, sorry.
I was just going to ask something around, so the question also mentions maintaining a provider states. So sometimes you might have a provider that provides for various consumers. And a question that often comes up is, well, if I'm a consumer, how do I know what the provider already offers, so that I don't have to go and ask them to create a brand new provider state that perhaps does exactly what I need?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. We'd like
So,
some way to be able to oh, sorry, you go, Matt.
That was Tim.
No, we'd really like some way to be able to publish those states back to the Pact broker. We haven't quite worked out an elegant way to do that, because the provider states tend to be declared and expressed in the native language of each provider. So it's a bit hard to try and think of a cross-language compatible way to express what's in a provider state. If you have any ideas on that, please come and talk to us. I tend not to reuse my states. Like, I tend to namespace them so that they don't overlap, but that's possibly because I've worked more on services that are quite small and don't have crazy numbers of consumers. And as you can see, the setting up the data for me is actually quite easy. Like, it's literally copy paste 5 lines and maybe tweak some names. So I found that's worked for me, rather than trying to make sure that everybody uses the same set of data. But different people will have different experiences that might lead them to have different approaches.
Yeah, I think there's an important point here, which is that the provider state is not a substitute for communication between your consumer team and your provider team. And so it's quite a good point that we don't have any recommendations for how people do that. And maybe we should, because this is what you'll need to communicate. I had an experience once where I was in a team of 2 where I was working on the client, and my teammate was working on the back end, and we were doing the API in a sort of test-driven way, where I would write the Pact tests and then he would implement the provider side. And even then, in a team of 2, there was quite a few places where he would come to me and he'd say, "What do you mean by this provider state?" And to me, it seemed very clear. It's sort of interesting, because I think that, like, if we were specifying programmatically how to configure the provider, then we sort of end up in that problem where you sort of have to define quite a bit of detail for it. Although it is useful to, like, we've seen people sort of serialize JSON objects and then use that as the provider state. And I think if that's what the provider team want to consume, it's sort of, we have this reverse problem where we really want the provider to specify what the states are, and for the consumers to drive the test.
Okay, I think this is going to be a topic that we could probably spend about 2 hours on. I think so. I think we'll keep trying to go through. I think it's acknowledged that this is obviously a really one of the harder things to get your head around when starting. And I'm always working on the docs, but do appreciate that that's it's a non-trivial thing to get started in. So I'm going to throw this one out to Anto. I think he's covered some of this already, but the next question was going to be, I'm convinced, but I don't know how to get started. It all seems too hard. What advice do you have? So I'm kind of hoping your talk was somewhat of an inspiration to answer that, but maybe there's some, you can start in a couple of different places. What were the things that led to getting that first step going?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sorry. I was actually
sorry, I was thinking that actually would be interesting to hear from some of these guys, because I kind of tell my stories, but I think you guys have had experiences of getting Pact in several of your clients. What's your experience?
Who wants to go on this one?
I'm happy to answer.
Because we understand a lot of the underlying engines, we actually don't have issues. Like for us, provider states just felt like a natural way of it. There's only one way to get it to work, right? So Beth came up with the idea, and I was like, yeah, there's no other way we can do that. So I don't know particularly myself how to address the things, but the things I have observed is sort of definitely collaboration between teams. Having a champion, I think you mentioned that in your talk, Anto, having a champion to push it, documentation definitely tries to help, and examples. So have a lot of time they'll do a pilot with maybe or a proof of concept with one particular subset of their system, and use that as an example to drive. Yeah, I mean,
personally, from my point of view, the safety blanket of the supposed safety blanket of end-to-end test is, I don't know about what the rest of the panel opens back, it's very hard to remove. There's this idea that if you don't have an end-to-end test, how do you know it's really working? Which we don't seem to apply that same logic to things like unit tests. I don't know if that's that's a similar experience of some of the other maintainers.
Absolutely. Maybe
I think the introduction documentation is something that we can definitely improve. So I think I'm probably one of the newest maintainers, if not the newest. I'm not sure. I learned most of what I know about Pact from Matt and Beth and Ron. I think that it is the case that the ecosystem can be a little overwhelming when you first come across it. So it's an area that we can definitely improve. I think there are some workshops which we have started highlighting a bit more on the website, and those are good places to start.
Matt?
Yeah, I might add a couple of things there. There is a couple of questions further down that this might check off as well. So someone asked about the docs being amalgamated. I think what you're referring to there is the Pact Flow docs and the Pact docs. And we're going to work through that, and probably at some point they will get amalgamated. It's just something we need to work through as a community. But I understand your concerns, and we'll do some work there. As Tim just alluded to as well, we've just added a lot more workshops and tutorials onto the docs website, which should help with some of this. But I think just really broadly speaking, I posted a link in the channel as well that pretty much kind of sums up our general advice with going with this stuff. As a few people just noted, Pact is a complex ecosystem, but it's trying to solve a really complex problem. So end-to-end tests are really what we're talking about in terms of trying to reduce, if not remove completely, by essentially taking what you've got, taking your test strategy, breaking it apart, and using contract testing as one part of that test strategy, and that's the part of the integration tests that are really responsible for making sure two things can communicate with each other, and really moving other parts of the remaining of that end-to-end test. So think about your end-to-end test. Most companies, from what I've seen, they're not just there to solve one problem. They're actually a bit of a catch-all. They kind of catch some functional tests from the consumer side, some end-to-end functional tests, some UAT tests, some smoke tests. They kind of do everything. When you start to look at that with a critical lens, you realize they're just kind of a catch-all. And so when you put contract testing in, it actually can take away a chunk of those tests. And then when you realize, actually, the remaining ones, a bunch of those are actually just functional tests for the provider. So let's move them into the provider code base. Then you see a bunch of them really just, well, we just want to check that the whole request cycle works before we release. We want to make sure I can log in or I can do a search or whatever that critical thing is. Let's make that a smoke test or a synthetic monitor. And you eventually whittle down your end-to-end test to go, well, what value am I actually getting from those? And that's when you're starting to get the benefits. So how to get started? Well, that's ultimately where you want to get to. But getting started is recognizing that end-to-end integration tests are a big cost to your business. And usually you won't recognize that as a problem unless you need to release more frequently and more often. Because if you don't do it more often, then you're not going to bother too much. You've probably already got a bunch of people who are dedicated to maintain those end-to-end tests, and they're not motivated to change either. So you got to find some kind of catalyst to move. That's really the first thing. And you've got to build a good business case to say, well, if we did this and ultimately make our way to the final destination, what's the value to the business? If you can't make that case and you can't convince people it's an interesting problem to solve, then you're probably not going to make it. And I'll just make one more comment, which is kind of what Ron was saying. I will observe that anytime you try to force contract testing in without getting general buy-in, eventually it's just going to disappear when you disappear. So you've really got to see that buy-in from the group.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I've seen that with the cultural thing, and I really like that quote about it's a complex problem you're trying to solve. But with this move to microservice architectures, that's a distributed architecture that is complex, and the old school testing strategies have got to come with it, and that can be sometimes hard to get across that that's a change of mindset in your testing as well as just your design. So this one, I think this will be for Matt, Beth, and Ron, a bit of a controversial one. So now that Pactflow exists, are you still going to be supporting the Pact broker? There seems to be an obvious commercial conflict. So I'll hand that hot one over to you.
Well, I think the short answer is yes. Beth might have more to add to it because she's one of the main maintainers. But I think, as you saw in my part of the talk earlier, it actually turned out we contributed more to the open source broker since Pactflow started, rather than less. So all things aside, we've definitely added more stuff to it since we've done Pactflow. But maybe I'll let Beth and or Ron talk to, I guess, how we're commercially trying to ensure that Pact lives on.
Yeah, I've spent the last 6 years of my life working on the Pact broker, the open source Pact broker, and I am passionate about open source. And we in no way want to kill the Pact broker for the sake of Pactflow. For one of the very practical reasons is that all the open source tooling needs to be able to interoperate with both the open source Pact broker and Pactflow at the same time. So we need to keep a certain level of consistency. So if there's any new features that are related to Pact that touch on the existing functionality, it's going to go into both. Where we might start to add things into Pactflow that are not in Pact, things that are to do with people management, scaling, roles, and trying to perhaps add visualizations and all these extras for large groups of people that really needs to go into a product that has commercial support.
I just want to mention that we don't actually see it as a
good.
We don't see it as a commercial conflict. We actually see the open source Pact broker as a way of widening potential Pactflow customers. So by making the open source broker very useful and us maintaining that, when people don't want to host it themselves, and if all the tooling just works with Pactflow, they can actually look at then move into Pactflow. So we actually see it as a tool to help us, and it's probably one of those things by helping us, we can get more revenue, which means we can get more time to spend on the open
Great.
source Pact.
So I'm going to kind of merge the next two questions, just being a bit mindful of time, because we've got about 5 minutes left. And so the next two top ones were, how can I tell have good coverage of an API of my Pact tests? And then the next one was also, which I think is semi-related, who typically writes and executes the Pact test? So I think this is kind of the mechanics of how do I write it? How do I make sure that they're testing the right thing, and who's kind of responsible?
Beth?
Well, I can tell you. Sorry. Just briefly, my view on this and like what happens at Treatwell, and this is something that I'm massively passionate about. I think with any type of tests, the best people that are to write those tests and get the value out of those tests, in my mind, are the same people who actually write the implementation itself and the production code. And my philosophy is that the more aligned the two activities are, the more successful your testing is going to be. So my top tip would be, unless it's to start implementing things and kicking things off, would be in a medium and longer term to just do it as a side activity to writing any other tests and writing your production code. And so avoiding having separate teams or separate individuals who are specifically dedicated to writing a category of tests like the Pact tests.
Yeah, I just tend to write them as a developer. I write my unit test, I write my Pact test. They just go together. Having said that, we do want to make Pact more accessible to people who aren't necessarily code first team contributors.
Cool. And just mindful of time, I'm going to ask one last question, which was not the next one, but just because I think it'll be a really quick one to answer. Can we get a status update on the progress of the Rust implementation? I know this is obviously for Ron, and I think it's a 4-year progress, I think we heard earlier, or was that just a spec?
Yeah, it's been 4 years since I started it. The Rust implementation is quite equivalent to the JVM one. I maintain both and I keep them in sync. So any functionality that's in the JVM one, I make sure works in a similar way. I try to make it in the same way, but obviously different languages have different semantics. It can be a bit hard. I reckon for full feature complete, it's about 95% there. There's a couple of things to do with interaction with the Pact broker, can I deploy, and the new whip packs and stuff like that still needs to be done. But apart from that, if you're just doing just normal Pact tests, wanting to verify providers, write consumer tests, it's all the functionalities there, same as with the Pact JVM. So V3, and I've been adding the new V4 spec features to it as well.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. Look, there were some really great questions. There's a few around branches and how to sort of maintain those. I think we're going to have to, unfortunately, just because of time, we'll try and answer those either on Twitter or I think we said Slack, didn't we? So I'm afraid we're just going to have to cut off there or something. But what we do is we've got these questions all inside out, and we're going to find a format to kind of play that back with some answers, because there's some really great ones in here, but they're just going to take longer than we have left, I'm afraid. So I just want to wrap up by saying thanks everyone for coming. I want to thank all the contributors for also giving up their time and providing some, I think you agree, some excellent content. The follow-on steps, so you should be getting, I think Matt's going to be creating some feedback questionnaire. This is really valuable to us. We want to get a feeling for, like, were we awesome or did we suck, that kind of stuff. But also, what are things that you want to see? When we talk about, maybe doing something in 2021 a little bit bigger, what would that look like? Hopefully we'll say that, hopefully do an in-person thing, but we kind of know what the level of interest is and what that would look like. Please reach out. There you go. There's the poll. I forgot that was going to come up just in time. You can follow us at Pact Up on Twitter. So we've got all the socials there, and obviously if you haven't joined the Slack channel, please do. That's there as well. And hopefully in the next few days we'll try and get through and answer all of those questions. We've got a record of them. And if you could, we've been tweeting this all day because we're broadcasting, we can't actually see you, unfortunately. But it'd be great to get what I call a Twitter applause. If you like what you had today, just a simple like on some of our tweets would just be awesome. And yeah, and thank you for coming. And I hope you got something out of today.
Thanks, Elliot. Just want to make a quick call out as well before we do run off. You know, without Elliot, who organised this session and ran the MC, you know, this was our first attempt trying this sort of thing. It's so far touched this table. I think it went pretty well. I've been trying to watch the stream as we went along. I thought it was a great session, and that's to do with everyone speaking today, but in particular Elliot, who's really tied this all together. So thank you so much, Elliot. Yep, exactly. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
The worst part about this session was we weren't able to see everyone, as you said, in the crowd. So we'd love to see you online and join our Slack channel. So thank you, Elliot. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Bye-bye.
That's it. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.